This is my 2004 Toyota Sienna, and I make it a point to treat the body with Crown or Rust Check spray every year, and it's stopped all structural rust. That's the oil creep you see on the bottom of the doors there. The oil creeps up and captures some dust. But here's a spot that I need to deal with. This is some surface rust that's actually started to spread. The paint here has gotten scraped off from gravel and snow and sleet and things, I imagine, over the years. So the paint's gone at the leading edge, and now water is creeping in. So it's quite solid. This rust isn't coming from the inside because the rust spray stops that, but I do have to do something here in the outside, and that's what this video is all about. The situation's a bit challenging. I'd rather not take off this sliding door here, so I'm going to be working around the door, doing most of the prep work and painting with the door closed like it is now, but I am going to have to open it up to work in from the inside. I could take the door off, and maybe I'll end up doing that, but I'd rather leave it on its sliding hinges for now. So I just thought you'd like to see what happens here and how this job turns out. The thing about these driveway auto body repair jobs is that you never really know the tools you're going to need until you get into it, but this multi-tool, cordless multi-tool, is what I'm going to be using to do the initial sanding. Now, I definitely don't want to hurt the paint on the sliding door here, so I've protected it. When it comes time to spraying this, I'll mask it more extensively, but this is just for some physical protection. I'll do some sanding here, and then maybe get into some sanding by hand along the gap, and then open up the door and sand in around the corner. But the idea now is just to get down to bare metal. There's going to be some pitting, so I'm going to have to make it smooth with some fine auto body filler, and then it will be priming, wet sanding the primer, and then applying the color coat and then the clear coat before some buffing. So that's the process in a nutshell. I'm just going to start some sanding now. Well, my original plan to sand and refinish this without doing something to the door isn't going to work. I really can't get in well enough. Sanding is super important to get back to bare metal whenever you can. So what I've discovered here is that I could remove the bolts that fasten this sliding arrangement. I can take them off of the back of the door, and as you can see here, the door can now swivel out a little bit. It's not putting any undue strain on any of the parts up ahead, any of the other sliding parts, but now I've got the door far enough out of the way and propped up that I can get in there and do a proper sanding. It's actually worked out pretty well. I've got most of the cruddy stuff removed. I need to go around the edge a little bit more. That's pretty well something I'll do by hand with some handheld paper. The next step after this is to build up the area with some very fine body filler. Not the kind that reacts with a hardener, but just the red kind that dries by evaporation, just to fill any little pinholes here. And we have lost some thickness too, of course. There's the primer and the paint and the clear coat, and if you run your finger over it, you can feel a little bit of a decline in elevation. And in order to get that looking as close to factory as possible, that has to be leveled up a little bit, and that's what I'll be doing next. With this door tilted out of the way, it was a lot easier to get in here and prep this properly. And that's what you see here. I'm going to be using some spot putty to fill in the little depressions there where there was some rust. But I also found some more surface rust here. This is all started from the outside that you see here around the actual door opening. It's hidden by the door and hard to see unless the door slides open like this, but I've scraped off the bubbled paint. I don't need to put a really nice paint job on this, so I'm not going to fill it the same way, but I am going to treat the rust here and in this spot here using a rust converter. This is the stuff I happen to have on hand now. It's a spray can, and it acts as a primer for paint as well. So I'll spray this on. Calls for 2 coats, and then wait a couple of days and then paint it. So that's my plan for this area. I'm going to do that now, and then I'll come back in a second and show you what the spot putty process looks like at the beginning. Well, here you see the area. I've done the spot putty to fill in the little rust pits and to smoothen the transition from the painted to the unpainted metal. My next step is going to be to prime this. The thing about priming is that you really do need to sand that primer. You don't just paint on top of it, you wet sand it. So that's what I'm going to be doing after I spray this. The sun's shining on this. I really should have turned the vehicle around before I took the door off of its slider, turned it around so that it would be in the shade. But because you really shouldn't paint in the sun. It'll cause the liquid to dry too fast. So I'm going to set up a cardboard shield to give me some shade here and spray paint this so that it's all ready for sanding. Well, I've got some primer on here now, and a couple of things to point out. First of all, the primer has, of course, extended beyond the area that I needed to prime. And if you look closely, you can see it. Yeah, there you can. Okay. There's a little flaw there. And up here too. And if you look very closely, down here, there's something. Now, if I don't do anything about that, this is going to show through the paint. It's not the end of the world. I'm looking at it very closely right now with the camera, and it is not a very prominent part of the vehicle. But I still want to take a shot at making it better. So what I'm going to do now, the primer is dry enough that I can wet sand it. So that's going to make it smooth. It's going to get rid of some of the dust bumps here. And if I didn't have these flaws, I would just leave it at that. And I would go to paint and clear coat and then buffing in order to blend the sheen with the rest of the vehicle. But I'm not going to stop here because of these flaws. The thing about primer is that you need to think of it like a kind of very thin body filler. A coat of primer does have thickness. So what I'm going to do here, after I've wet sanded, and I'll show you this in a minute, is I'm going to spray some primer in a little container, and then I'm going to use a Q-tips to daub it on there and build up the primer in that area, and then sand it flush. I should be able to get rid of most, if not all, of these little flaws you see here, so that I have a nice perfect coat for painting. The coat, the surface has got to be perfect before painting, or else it's going to show through in the paint no matter what you do. This area here I'm not worried about right now. I've sprayed it with a rust encapsulator, and I'm going to let it dry for a few days and spray paint this, the color, the finished color later. But right now I'm just going to work up a better surface here for this primer. So I've applied some more primer, several coats, and I've let it dry overnight, and I've wet sanded it, and pretty well perfect. There's a few little spots here. It actually looks worse on camera than it does in real life. I think I'm ready to go here with paint. I'm going to let this sit probably for a couple of days before I paint it, because one of the problems you can run into at this time is if you paint the primer too soon, the off-gassing from the primer can affect the paint and cause it to do funny things. So just to show how flawless this is, let me just turn on a little bit of water here. The water sort of shows up any flaws. You can see it's quite smooth now. The wet sanding is really the trick with the primer. I use 400 grit wet dry paper and feathered the primer out to the rest of the body. You'll see the paint and the clear coat is scuffed here a little bit from the sandpaper, but that's okay because I'm going to go about this high with the paint, and then I'm going to go about this high with a clear coat, and then buff everything so that the sheen and the transition matches. The thing that you'll see later on is whenever you stop spraying, there's always overspray. It's kind of bumpy, and it's the little globules of finishing material form a rough surface. That's unavoidable, and you can't mask the areas where you don't want to get that, because there's going to be a straight line where the masking tape stops. So that's where buffing comes in, to blend the repaired area with the rest of the body. And it's quite effective too, as you'll see later on. But right now we're finished with the rust removal. We've got a good coat of primer on here. It's been wet sanded. There's nothing that I can feel here. There's no ridges I can feel anywhere. It's just a perfect transition. So now we've got our basis for paint. I've got the first coat of spray paint on here. The primer I let sit for a couple of days after wet sanding, just to make sure all the solvents had off-gassed. And this is looking pretty good. I'm going to give it another coat or two, and then some clear coat. It's got to sit for about a week after that before it can be wet sanded and buffed. You can see the body here is shinier than the coat of paint right now, but at least we're getting the right color. And it's amazing what wet sanding and buffing can do. So I'll just continue with the coats and then clear coat, and then get back to you with the next steps. So I've just applied the first coat of clear coat. I'll give it at least one more, maybe two. And then when it's dry later today, I'll put that weather stripping back that you see here, and get the door back on its rear sliding bracket, and then I'll just let it dry for a week, and then come back and do some wet sanding and buffing. Those two steps really make a very big difference. So I'm eager to show you those. Things are already looking really good. If you remember what this looked like before, we had a lot of rust bubbles around the front, and then there was some surface rust that was developing underneath this weather stripping too. So that's all fixed, and we're in good shape. And it's all happened in this driveway here. So, well, the door's back on its slider now, and you can see how things worked out. I'm very pleased. Some wet sanding and buffing is going to happen later to just blend it in with the rest of the job, but there we go. Driveway rust repair. So now it's time for wet sanding the clear coat and doing some buffing. And I just want to show you a few things going on here. This is a scratch through the clear coat that existed before my repair. So I'm going to extend the wet sanding and buffing up this high. I think I can make that completely disappear. Now it's been about a week since I did this painting, and 500 or 600 miles of driving, and unfortunately the same dynamic that caused the paint to get damaged along this leading edge is still at work. I really don't understand what it is, because this is the side of the vehicle near the back, so I don't know what's hitting the paint every so often. What I've decided to do is to wet sand and buff, and then just leave this alone. And then when all the water's dry and I'm finished, I'm going to get a Q-tips and I'm going to spray a little bit of the paint into a container and just daub it on there and hide it. When it's thoroughly dry, I'll put some wax on there. Maybe that'll help protect it too. I'm not sure. I don't know if you can see it on the camera here, but I did overdo it a bit with the clear coat, so I have a bit of a run here. You can't see it from normal angles, but I'm going to see if the wet sanding will help that too. When it comes to wet sanding at this stage, it's wet dry paper. This is 2000 grit. I'm going to actually start with 1500 with some water, and then switch to 2000, and then use some rubbing compound on a foam pad in a random orbit wood sander to actually do the buffing. I know from experience that it works pretty well, so I'll just get started here. So here's the 1500. I just like to, when I do this, just to keep the area flooded with water. It's mostly about leveling and getting rid of the overspray where the clear coat met the rest of the existing paint job. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's sort of some white areas. That's where the sandpaper is doing its job. You have to be careful around corners too. If I were to sand very much here, I'd go right through everything, and that would be no good. So 1500 is mostly just about leveling. I don't need to go underneath too far, since that's not going to be seen. And make sure you don't get any grit in there. So I'll continue like this for another minute or two, and then switch to 2000 grit and do the same thing again. So this is my trusty random orbit sander. I usually use it for wood finishing, but with this foam pad, it's also great for auto body buffing. I've made videos about this before. I got this on Amazon, and this is the rubbing compound. I have another pad like this that I use with the buffing compound. It's finer, and if you need to go a little bit shinier, that's the way to do it. Now before I get going here, you'll notice though, this looks a whole lot worse than it did before, didn't it? I mean, I probably didn't even need to buff it before, but now certainly it doesn't look very good. And that's what happens with the leveling from the sandpaper, the wet dry sandpaper. What you've got here is a 2000 grit finish, and it has smoothed and leveled the clear coat. So this buffing process is going to bring that to a new car finish. Just going to wet the pad a little bit here. It's a wet process, and we'll be using some more water later. Squirt a little bit of this stuff on. Now I have this sander turned down fairly slow to start, and of course I'm going to be overlapping into other areas because the door is here and I don't want to remove it. Don't really need to in this case, but this is what it looks like. Now the thing about buffing like this is that you really don't know how you're doing until you rinse the surface and let it dry and take a look. So before we were pretty dull and kind of whitish because of the wet sanding, but I think it's looking pretty good now. This scratch is less than it used to be. I think I'll buff that a little bit more, probably with the next finer compound. But whereas before you could feel kind of a rough transition where the clear coat stopped and the little particles kind of hit the existing clear coat and dried, now it's just a perfectly smooth transition, nice and shiny. I'd be completely happy right now if it wasn't for these chips, which I will touch up. I'm sure I'm going to have to touch them up continually. And as I said, maybe a coat of wax, a couple of heavy coats of wax in this area might help protect it. I really don't know what's chipping that since there are no wheels around and everything, but anyway, this is rust repair the way I do it in the driveway. There may be better ways to do it, but I think it turned out pretty well, and I'll keep driving the old van for a while without it looking too rough. Thanks for watching. Click here to join the thousands of people who get the Bailey Line Road hands-on how-to newsletter for free every Saturday morning.